very much. Michael, thank you very much. Thanks all of you for being here at this early hour. I appreciate it. I was told to talk about climate change and prospects going forward, what thoughts occur after the effort we made here this last month to proceed on climate change legislation. I think you're all aware that on the 6th of June we tried to invoke cloture to proceed to real consideration of the Lieberman-Warner Climate Security Act, and we were not able to do that at that time. We did not have the votes. I think we're also generally aware that that was the one real opportunity we had in a legislative sense to move ahead on this issue before the end of this Congress, since the end of this Congress is scheduled for 8 or 9 weeks of legislative activity from now. From one perspective, the short debate that we had in the Senate on the measure was a disappointment. There were no substantive amendments that were offered since we were trying to invoke cloture to proceed to the bill, or really to go ahead. Despite the tremendous effort that was put into it by Senators Lieberman and Warner and Boxer, and all of them deserve great commendations for their efforts. But despite those efforts, much of the debate was very general. Much of the debate did not, and I think pretty much all of the debate did not get into specific merits of particular parts of the proposal. If you look at it another way, though, the debate was very encouraging, at least from my perspective. I think it demonstrated very clearly that Congress is now past the period of talking about whether or not climate change is a reality. We're on to the agenda of how do we put together a proposal, a mandatory regulatory regime to mitigate global climate change in a significant way. And that's a major undertaking, but the fact that we have gotten to that point and have a consensus on that, I think, is encouraging. Nobody really expected that we could pass legislation in this Congress. The President, of course, indicated in several statements that he would veto any mandatory limits on greenhouse gases that would be put forward in the form of a cap and trade system. And I think clearly a lot of people in Congress, myself included, needed the additional time to try to master the complexities of the issue, not just the complexities of climate change itself, but the complexities involved in trying to craft a plan to deal with the problem in a meaningful way. One thing I do believe is clear to most of us at least, and that is that any proposal to seriously address the challenges of responding to climate change will require sustained action over many years. And that would include a sustained commitment to keep taking increasingly more stringent actions over the decades ahead. To approach the problem responsibly, it's important to understand two things about the scale of the global climate change issue. First, we need to understand the scale of the problem. Second, we need to understand the scale of the system, the energy system that we have for producing and using energy, which is the major cause, the major source for greenhouse gas emissions. We need to understand the scale of that and what's involved in trying to change that. Michael referred to the fact that his center his group is focused on transitioning the economy from a high carbon economy to a post-carbon economy. That's a major undertaking, and I think we're all just awakening to that fact. We have to keep an eye on both of these issues. On the one hand, if we fail to recognize how enormous and urgent the problem of climate change is, then we may fail to act responsibly and sensibly and soon. Clearly, we need to do all of those. On the other hand, if we fail to recognize the enormity of the the task that we're taking on, I think we may embark on a course of action without making it clear at the start that there are going to be sacrifices and changes of a major nature involved. There are 4 possible strategies for dealing with climate change that have been floated in one form or another in the recent months and years. The first strategy, which I would attribute pretty much to the current administration, is to rely primarily on funding of research and development for new energy technologies and rely on voluntary measures by the private sector to solve the problem. By itself, in my view, technology development is not going to do the job. New technology is always going to be more expensive initially than the conventional way of doing things. So unless we start putting a price or cost, recognizing the cost associated with greenhouse gas emissions from conventional industrial and electricity plants, we will not be able to change the incentives that result in the current dominant position of high carbon energy technologies. So I don't think the first strategy is adequate. Second strategy that's been advocated by several is the idea of a carbon tax. This is the path that the province of British Columbia just recently chose. While this would clearly associate a price with greenhouse gas emissions, we do not know ahead of time what price would result in the most effective reductions of such emissions. Too low a price and you're just increasing energy costs without changing the balance of energy technologies that are being implemented. And too high a price and you are changing consumers, you're charging consumers more than they need to pay in order to see the desired change in greenhouse gas emissions. So I also wonder, frankly, when we hear all the discussion about a carbon tax, I wonder whether some of my colleagues in the Senate who criticized the cap and trade proposal and have argued instead for a carbon tax, whether those are individuals who've also signed the pledge against imposing any new taxes. I remember one conversation with a member of Congress early in my time here in Washington where he said he was not opposed to seeing new taxes imposed, he was just opposed to voting for them. A third strategy that has been contemplated for dealing with the climate crisis, and one that really has been implemented to some extent, is to directly try to regulate greenhouse gas emitters through command and control regulations. But if you think of the size and complexity of the energy system that we're trying to change, direct regulation on a plant-by-plant basis seems fairly impractical. If we also, or it will also likely be more expensive to consumers. It's economically inefficient. The economists tell us that it's inefficient to squeeze reductions from some sources when those same reductions could be achieved somewhere else far cheaper. And of course, that brings you to the idea of cap and trade. And that's the fourth strategy. I believe that it is the most reasonable strategy for us to try to move ahead with at this time. The advantages of a cap and trade system is that the advantage is that it places a cap on total emissions, but it incorporates flexibility mechanisms that allow regulated entities to seek out the cheapest possible reductions that can be achieved throughout the economy. I believe most members of Congress are persuaded that this is the preferred strategy to pursue. Both of our presidential candidates in the upcoming election have agreed that this is the way to proceed. Not all of the cap and trade designs, of course, that have been proposed, at least in my view, would be workable in helping us to achieve what we all would like to see achieved through a cap and trade system. So at this point, I'd like to sort of lay out some thoughts. I've divided them into 10 separate thoughts or principles that I think should be considered as we try to move forward with legislation for consideration in the next Congress, and that is the task before us over the next few months, is to try to get consensus on what the new administration and the new Congress would be able to move ahead with. The first of these 10 is that, in my view, the legislation should be focused pretty exclusively on the effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This has to be the paramount goal. There's a temptation to use climate change legislation to accomplish a number of different priorities, many of which are noble and worthwhile. There's a lot of revenue generated through a cap and trade system, through the sale of allowances, and a temptation to use that revenue for multiple good purposes. But given the difficulty and complexity associated with just transforming the energy sector, if we try to make legislation of this type serve a variety of other worthy purposes as well, we'll wind up with a system that is too complex to get off the ground. That leads me to the second point. In my view, we need to avoid making climate change legislation any more complicated than is necessary. We should try to pass legislation with a minimum of carve-outs, either for particular states or regions or for particular industries. If we're to have long-term support and buy-in from the public, the program will need to be sufficiently transparent and straightforward that it can be generally understood by those who pay attention to this issue. A third general thought or principle is that we need to be realistic about how well we can plan for the distant future. Global climate change is a long-term problem that will need decades of sustained commitment. And having said that, in my view, it's unrealistic to imagine that we can legislate today for the next 30 or 40 years and expect to get it right. The bill that was recently before the Senate contemplated various standing 42-year permanent appropriations. I think the reality is that we do not really know what our climate-related priorities will be that far into the future. New information on the climate challenge will become available. New technologies for responding to the challenge will either be proven to work or will be proven not to work. We need to force a fresh look at the whole problem at least once each decade, and that probably means crafting legislation at this juncture that will have to be reauthorized in order to force Congress to do that fresh look. Fourth thought is that we need to make use of our existing departments and agencies to administer the programs, and Congress needs to be involved in the appropriating of the funds through its regular committee structure. There's always an attraction to creating new institutions, new boards, new trust funds in order to bypass existing structures. An institution that exists only in concept can look far better than the flawed institutions that we have to deal with on a daily basis. But there's a significant time and opportunity cost associated with starting a new institution from scratch. And since addressing climate change is an urgent matter, we probably do not have the luxury of inventing significant new portions of the federal government before we undertake this serious effort. Fifth, we need to set ambitious but achievable targets for emission reductions. Targets are important to give certainty and guidelines to those who need to plan. They're important to set out what is necessary to avoid dangerous interference with the climate system. But it will not do us any good to legislate targets that are unattainable or technologically unfeasible. Public support for the program will erode over time if the only thing that we accomplish is a failure to achieve overly aggressive targets. For a reality check on what is achievable, I think a good place to start is the Energy Technology Perspectives 2008 report that was issued last month by the International Energy Agency. That report sets out the actions that are required to achieve two different scenarios. The first scenario that they lay out there is the actions required to ensure that global greenhouse gases emitted in 2050 are no greater than those emitted today. And when you review that report, you'll be persuaded that that's a fairly robust agenda of action items that will have to be accomplished across our entire economy. And the second scenario details the actions required essentially to do what the G8 announced yesterday, and that is to reduce total greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by the year 2050 from today's level. As the report makes clear, the second of these scenarios can only be achieved with an enormous change in the way that our economies function throughout the world. And the way we produce and use energy throughout the world. The sixth thought is that we need to provide assurances that the costs of a cap and trade system will not go out of control, either through excessive prices for emission allowances or excessive volatility in those prices. We need to be clear to the American people that a new regulatory program will increase our energy prices, and that those increases are necessary as investments to reduce climate change. Costs that go out of control, however, will merely shake public confidence in the legislation, will endanger the stability of the policy. I was concerned that the efforts to control cost in the legislation that we were considering on the floor were inadequate. Its cost containment mechanisms, its main cost containment mechanism was a provision to have another auction of allowances with a floor price that was more than double the floor price in a regular auction. In my view, any effective cost control would have to provide for a ceiling price on allowances rather than a floor price. Seventh principle or thought is that we need an upfront commitment to technology even before cap and trade legislation could take effect. Especially what's needed is to figure out if carbon capture and storage will work on the scales or at the scale that will be needed. We need to invest in this technology agenda immediately, even before the implementation of a cap and trade system, so that we can figure out right away if our caps are based on technically viable options and whether coal can continue to play the major role that it historically has played in energy generation. If carbon capture and storage is found not to be viable, that will severely alter the energy policy pathways that we will need to be pursuing. The eighth thought is that we need to figure out how any new climate change law will interact with the Clean Air Act. Recent Supreme Court decisions have mandated that the EPA regulate at least some carbon dioxide emissions under the Clean Air Act. Either we make clear at the outset that a new climate change law supersedes whatever might be in the Clean Air Act, or we work through in detail what responsibilities are covered under each statute so that we do not have extensive confusion and wasted time and a multiplicity of court cases. The ninth thought about this issue is that we need to ensure that we start the program up in a workable manner, including the initial deadlines and timetables that we put into law. Agencies and departments will have to produce several sets of new rules. Those rules will require adequate study and public input. The federal government will also have to administer activities such as auctions at a scale that we have not carried out in the past. We need to make sure that we set deadlines for the rulemaking and for these new activities and responsibilities that are achievable in the real world of federal agency operations. 10th, and finally, this mercifully is the last of these, there needs to be a single national cap and trade program for greenhouse gases, in my view. The energy infrastructure in the United States crosses state boundaries, and energy markets are regional and national in scope. We cannot, in my view, effectively regulate something as central to our energy system as carbon dioxide emissions on a state-by-state basis. We should not overlay cap and trade programs over other cap and trade programs. States have a legitimate role in promoting energy efficiency and clean energy technology, separate from and in addition to a cap and trade system, but we should not have multiple overlapping cap and trade systems in place. I say this with the recognition that my own state of New Mexico would like to start regulating greenhouse gases directly, and perhaps do so by joining with other Western states in a regional cap and trade partnership. And in the absence of a federal program, there's no way to fault that initiative at the state level. Clearly the states have moved ahead here more quickly than we in Washington have, and that's to their credit. But when, and I believe it's not if, but when, we are able to enact a federal cap and trade system, in my view, it should preempt the field. That's one more reason why it's imperative that the federal government act sooner to deal with this issue rather than later. So in conclusion, let me just refer again to the fact that the G8 in Japan did end their meeting yesterday with this statement that all of the G8 countries, including the United States, are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 50% of current levels by the year 2050. I guess I had two thoughts when I saw that news. One thought is that it is perhaps a cynical thought, is that it's easier to make that commitment to what ought to happen by 2050 in the last 6 months of an 8-year administration than in the first 6 months. The other thought is, I remember someone saying at one time, we are about to learn what Moses learned over 2,000 years ago, and that is the easy part is writing it down. And the challenge of crafting a proposal and legislation that will actually work to meet the kind of goal that the G8 has adopted is enormous. Congress needs to plan to work with the new president in meeting that challenge, and I, of course, pledge my best efforts to help in that regard.